Morning, everyone. My name is Matt Kelly, Extension Manager here at FarmLink. We're here today for the webinar on frost in cereals. This is an initiative by the GRDC on minimising the impact of spring radiation frost on grain yield and stability. So what we're trying to achieve is improve pre-season planning, informed in-season management decisions and effective post-frost responses. So we've got a great lineup of speakers here, headlined by Felicity Harris, cereals guru from the New South Wales DPI. Cieran Maxwell, Feed Central General Manager, who'll just do a bit of Q&A on where we're sitting with the hay market and what are the options, I suppose, if we do have some frosted or heated hay. And then finishing with the Agronomist Roundtable with some regional agronomists from around southern New South Wales and central New South Wales. So a quick weather update, where we've been over since our last webinar at the start of the month. Really our only main frost was sort of the 1st and 2nd of September. You can see on the left-hand side there, we had these days below zero. So a few days in that week below zero, mainly sort of central and then a strip out into the Western Division. And then once you drop that graph below -2, you see it was really only centralised around Young, Cowra, and that region, which is where we're starting to get into the more damaging temperatures. I guess the flip side of that is the heat that we've started to have over the last couple of days. So I guess that's where Felicity's work really comes in, is trying to hit that sweet spot between the two of them. So this is 2 days ago. This is sort of the 27-degree temperatures through here. And then yesterday was sort of even worse, where we saw that hotter band come further east, sort of 29, 28 degrees, Temora, West Wyalong, and then sort of carrying through. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Felicity Harris, who is going to run through some of her work. I'll just stop sharing my screen and let her fire away.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Matt and the FarmLink crew for the invite this morning. Yeah, so I guess I just thought that I'd run through. Obviously, the brief was on frost, but as with anything that I will present, I'll tell you that phenology comes first. So it's obviously very important for getting it right for frost. But as Matt alluded to, we obviously need to be balancing that out with water use and heat stress at the back end of the flowering window as well. So what I'm going to cover off this morning is just going through a few slides, just sort of having a look at some photos that I've taken over the last couple of years in our phenology evaluation work of some frost damage and how it directly relates to the development stage that plants are at the timing of the frost, because frost damage obviously can look really quite different. So I think that's one of the big key factors. And then just running through a little bit of an update of how things are tracking, I suppose, this year, which I'm sure the Agronomist Roundtable put into much better perspective than I will. So, yeah, so I guess just starting off, quite a few people perhaps might have seen this diagram that I might have presented before. So it's essentially a bit of analogy about some racehorses. So we've got sprinters and stayers. So our stayer types are our winter wheats that, we can sow earlier in April. They will stay in that vegetative period for longer, because that's afforded by a response to vernalisation or cold. And we know that by doing that, we can get them to flower at the optimal flowering window. But we've also got, in the range of cultivars that are available to us, we've also got some of those faster spring types, which really, because of the lack of developmental holds that they have, we need to be sowing them in a different sowing window. So here, the analogy is that this sprinter, which here is black caviar, needs to be sown in May for it to be able to flower in that optimal window. And that optimal flowering window, there's been a lot of work done on that, particularly recently by Bonnie Floor and James Hunt, but we've been trying to refine that regionally as well for a lot of our locations in New South Wales. But ultimately, obviously, we're focused on frost today, but it really is about balancing the amount of biomass that we're producing and maximising our grain yield. And so it's really driven not only by frost, but a number of other abiotic factors. So this is, I guess it's sort of really important, because I suppose in the key sort of thing that we've got available in terms of frost mitigation tools, phenology really is first. Our most important thing that we can do is making sure that we're trying to sow the right varieties at the right time to achieve this optimal flowering window. So that's sort of key, and so that's just to put that up front. So I guess the next thing in terms of our cereal varieties is, you know, how different are they in terms of susceptibility to frost? So this is a really nice diagram. It's been updated by Ben Bidoff and the crew at DPIRD, and it's part of what will be released shortly in the next sort of week or so as an updated frost guide for cereals. So bit of a plug for that later on, but I guess I would be looking to sort of try and encourage people to have a bit of a look at that, because it's got some great information and particularly for advisors and growers trying to identify frost, some really good pictures to sort of look at as well. But essentially what we've got here is along this sort of x-axis, we've got the crop as it proceeds through that sort of germination, vegetative period through to the reproductive phase. And then we've got on this axis the frost susceptibility. So the timing of the development stage really determines the frost susceptibility of these varieties. And what's really nice about this graph is it shows that this sort of blue line is wheat. So as we follow it up, we know that we're sort of peaking at that sort of flowering time as being our most susceptible time to frost. But you can see, you know, during those sort of stem elongation and flag leaf emergence booting stages, we're quite susceptible as well. So wheat can be quite susceptible during these phases. We all sort of talk about, you know, barley being a bit more frost tolerant potentially compared to wheat, and there's certainly been some work along those lines. And this graph really just shows that we certainly do see that barley certainly can be a little bit less susceptible to frost, but the timing of the frost event also is quite different. So we find that that peak in barley is a bit later during sort of grain development, and that's probably largely driven by the fact that barley, you know, particularly in our system, is capped at 2 rows. So we don't have that compensation ability in barley that we potentially do in wheat. And then oats obviously is the other sort of cereal variety, and you can see that the susceptibility of oats is quite different as well. We do see that sort of increase in susceptibility of oats during that stem elongation period, and you see in the paddock that they certainly seem to be more characterised by those vegetative leaf damage and of frost and during that winter stages compared to some of our other cereal varieties. But then you can see that susceptibility sort of drops off into that grain filling period. So I think that's probably a really nice figure to keep in the back of our mind. But I guess the key point is that the frost symptoms that we actually see in the paddock after a frost event are really directly related to the stage of crop development. And so in terms of actually making decisions, frost ID really is key. So keeping all of that in mind, I've just sort of got a series of photos that I've taken sort of over the last couple of years, having a look at sort of frost damage at different development stages. So I thought I'd just sort of walk you through what some of that might look like. So these photos on this slide were taken back in 2017. So we had really severe frost conditions at Wagga where these trials photos were taken in 2017. So in that season, we had 92 days below zero, and about 60 of those were below -2. So it wasn't just about a frost event and severity of frost. It was also about the sort of number of frost events that these plants are exposed to, and which will obviously have a compounding effect on the damage that we see as well. So some really sort of severe, I suppose, examples of what frost damage during that stem elongation period can look like. And now these are images taken from varieties sown outside of their window. So this example was H45 sown in early April, and this photo was taken in August. And you can see here that when we dissected this stem, which you can sort of see in the background, looks otherwise quite healthy and green, but when we dissected out the little developing head that was encased within the stem, at this stage it was about at the growth stage 32 stage. You can see that sort of that complete killing of that developing head. So that's a really sort of severe, I suppose, quite a severe damaged image. Then the photo on the right, again, it's a fast sown dart, so it's quite a fast spring, sown in early April, photo taken at the end of August in 2017, and this is the plant. So you can see here characterised a lot of that sort of vegetative frost tipping of the leaves. You can see that some of the more advanced heads here that were starting to poke out at the time have been frost affected and stuck in the boot. But where this arrow is pointing to is about that second node. And you can see here the photo that I've zoomed in on the right-hand side, saying similar to the left, where that head's just very underdeveloped and didn't progress. So that's where the really sort of severe frost damage can look like. During, so moving on to sort of the next sort of stages, I suppose, and this is probably, you know, there would have been some cereals in this sort of stage this year during those sort of August frost events, potentially in that sort of flag, leaf and booting stages, some of the earlier sown and advanced crops. And what we tend to see here is, yeah, frost damage presents quite differently. So you can often see that we see heads where, you know, there's bleaching of the awns and the head doesn't actually sort of physically push free of the flag leaf. So you actually have to sort of dissect out this flag leaf and have a bit of a look and see what that looks like. And then you can also sort of see, you know, in some of these heads that might have been a little bit more developed, they've started to push out and been frosted sort of in that early, in that sort of pushed out sort of post-frost event. But you can see here that sort of severe damage that they've been exposed to. But this is quite a critical time for frost in terms of development. And the reason why it can be quite severe is that this sort of stage is when we're really sort of looking at that critical time for building grain number in cereals. And it's during that sort of early pollen development stages. And so when we get a frost event that can be quite severe at this stage, it can be sort of, yeah, complete sort of head or partial head damage. So yeah, so I know we sort of say flaring's really key, but we definitely can see some really severe damage when we see frost at these stages at times. Moving into the sort of ear emergence stages, so a bit later in development, we tend to see, again, frost present quite differently. We often see that the head itself is more formed and the damage that we see during emergence can be more sort of partial head damage. So you can see here that these three heads were all sort of exhibiting anthers here at the time when I sampled them, but you can see that the frost has affected them at different times, and that's largely just dependent on the stage that sort of head development was at the time of the frost. So here you can see the central florets, which would have been formed first, have continued to be development, but we've got frost tipping of the top of the head and at the base of the head. Whereas the one next to it, we've got some sort of central spikelets formed. We've tipped out on the bottom, but then we've sort of kept the top ones, and then again a bit of partial sort of head damage in the one on the right. And so the other thing that we also can see when we see frost, which is sort of quite unique to frost, is we also see these sort of banding, yellow banding on the peduncle during this stage. We don't tend to see this quite as obvious as in sort of New South Wales commonly. Most years where we see often this partial head damage, we don't often see it part and parcel with this peduncle ringing, but this year it's been really obvious in trials where we've seen frost at this stage. And I think largely that's to do with sort of the moisture status of the plants. And yeah, Ben Bidoff in the West tells me that it's quite common to sort of see where the frost occurs after a rain event where the sort of where the sort of cells are more hydrated, and yeah, they sort of tend to see that ringing of the peduncle. But it certainly has been something we've seen a lot more this year, and I think that's largely to do with interactions with the season. And then obviously we can have this really severe frost damage during flowering. So these are taken out of our National Phenology Initiative trial this year, where it's a really fast spring variety sown really early, and we've had frost come in that August stage when this was sort of in that early late flowering, early grain filling stage. And you can see here when we zoom in that basically has resulted in sterile florets. So we've got the anthers haven't extruded, they're sort of really pale, shaped like that sort of banana shaped and unformed, and they just simply haven't gone on to produce a grain. So this is sort of quite severe and really sort of, I suppose, reminiscent of quite late frost damage that we might see. So I guess, yeah, that just sort of goes through, I suppose, some of the, observations that we might see with frost. They're certainly all taken out of trials where we've sown things in outside of their window. So all of those photos are quite sort of severe frost damage that hopefully we wouldn't sort of see the same scale of frost damage where we've sort of got better alignment of our varieties in terms of growth stage, with the exception of just sort of some freak frost events that we do sometimes see in seasons. But certainly I suppose the key thing to point out is that, yeah, the damage that we actually see in the paddock is really largely aligned with the development stage that the plant was at the timing of the frost. And so that sort of, I suppose, knowing where the plants were at the timing of the frost will help us actually identify that damage. So I suppose one of the key things that we sort of say to growers and agronomists after a frost event is to go out and have a look at the paddocks, do some prioritisation. So have a look at low-lying areas and frost hollows first. One really good tip is to sort of mark some plants in paddocks and observe what growth stage that they're at the time of the frost, and then come back in sort of 7 to 10 days. And if those plants haven't sort of, I suppose, continued to progress in terms of their development, it's a good sign that you might need to have a bit of a look and see where things are up to. But I think, yeah, the key thing in terms of identifying frost is that it takes time to show up, and it can be really variable. So in sort of a warmer, drier season, we see frost show up quite quickly after a frost event, which we did in sort of 2017 and 2018. Whereas this year we've sort of had that frost in August, and even now, you know, it's sort of really hard to actually see the extent to which that frost damage is going to show up. And so that sort of really interaction with season and moisture availability, hopefully this year, yeah, is really key. So I guess the take-home message there is that obviously we need to get out and have a look, and frost ID is really key. But I think it's certainly it can be really variable. So we can see the frost damage present, but the extent to which that damage is actually going to translate into yield loss is really hard, and it's to quantify, and it's really dependent on the season and moisture sort of status of the plant and things like that. So I guess the key thing is to not panic initially, but to, you know, take a targeted approach of, you know, really clearly observing paddocks and across the canopy and looking at all of the tillers on a plant, not just looking at that primary tiller, which will be the most advanced and potentially the most subjected to damage, but actually have a look at all of the tillers on the plant, because it's likely that the damage won't be quite as bad as we first think. So that's probably the key thing. In terms of, I suppose, one of the things that's probably going to come in, or seems to be coming now, is obviously temperature stress. So one of the sort of key things that we also see is that we often hear that frost damage can be sort of confused with drought tipping. So a couple of examples of some severe drought tipping that we've seen in trials in the last couple of years. So this is 2018. The photo on the left is from a slow spring variety flowering outside its window in Emerald in central Queensland. So it's that really severe sort of drought tipping that we see. And the photo on the right is a paddock of Beckham from Junee in 2018, where we've got that sort of drought tipping, and then we had a rain event in early October, which enabled that sort of those bottom spikelets, which were still going to sort of really try and compensate there. So I guess the key thing with drought tipping is when we see it in the field is we generally see that sort of tipping of the head, and it's across the whole canopy and across the whole paddock. The difference with frost is because we have quite an asynchronous canopy and we have tillers at all different stages of development, is that we tend to see frost damage present quite variably dependent. So we might see, you know, some awns that are stuck in the boot, we can see some partial head damage, and then you might have completely undamaged tillers. So frost is really quite, can be quite sort of different across the canopy, whereas drought tipping tends to sort of exhibit these similar symptoms across the canopy. So that's probably a key thing. So I guess that's just, I suppose, some pictures, and just to have a bit of a look and to try and just, you know, reinforce, you know, the importance of actually identifying damage and associating a frost event with the time of development to help you do that. But again, coming back to, I suppose, the key thing, as I said, our main frost mitigation tool is to optimise phenology and sowing time. So this is a diagram that James Hunt developed, and essentially showing a similar thing to what we had in the earlier diagram. So the fast sort of spring wheat sown late in our sowing window, that shortened vegetative period, but we're getting it to flower at that right period. Whereas our winter wheat will have that extended vegetative period, and we've sort of got to manage all of these frost, heat and drought risk to try and get that right. So it all really comes back down to our time of sowing. So if we know, I suppose, that what we're really wanting to target is an optimal flowering period, I guess the next sort of thing is we've done a lot of modelling regionally, so to try and sort of identify what some of these optimal flowering periods based on long-term climatic history might be regionally. But what I've done here is just taken a slightly different approach. So what I've done here is I've pulled some data for wheat, so for 30 different varieties of wheat sown across 4 times of sowing in 2017, 18 and 19. So 17 and 18 were at Wagga in sort of high frost incidence years, and the 2019 site was at Mara, so in a year where largely frost wasn't the issue. It was really that terminal drought and heat stress. We had sort of some above 30-degree temperatures during early grain fill, which had more of a significant effect than frost did in that season, so playing on different abiotic stresses. But essentially what we've got here, so what I've done is I've consolidated that data. So along the x-axis is flowering date, and along this axis is yield, which has been normalised as the difference from the site mean. So if we sit at 0 and run that line along, that's essentially average yield for those 3 seasons. And just to put a bit of perspective around that, the site means for 2017 was about 3 tonne, for 2018 1.86, and for 2019 1.73. So across those 30 varieties and 4 times of sowing, they were the average site yields in those years. So essentially what I've done is I've basically taken all of the data for the 3 years. So this curve basically represents all of the data for those 3 years and the flowering range for those 3 years. And the black line essentially is a 10-day running average, so of yield response to flowering date, essentially across that whole window. So so each of these black dots essentially, or black points, represents any varieties that were flowering 5 days prior and 5 days after to that point. So it's like a 10-day running average of flowering yield response. And so you can see how that sort of curves up, and we've sort of got that, optimal sort of flowering window there in sort of early October. And then essentially what I've done then is I've fitted the 90th and the 10th percentile line. So if you like, this is the risk associated with that, and this is using real data. So these are in 2 really high frost risk years and 1 really high terminal drought and minimal frost risk year. These are the actual risk associated with that. So we've done a lot of modelling, so where we've pulled in 50 to 60 years of climate data to predict what an optimal flowering period is based on frost and heat risk, and that's what is defined by this dark blue dotted line. So for this environment, sort of in that Wagga environment, we're looking at an optimal flowering window within there. But if we, and I suppose the nice thing is that our data actually fits that quite well. So these 3 years of data, I've just refined that optimal flowering period to be a little bit tighter. So that's not to say that in a year, which is probably more like 2019, that you could flower earlier than optimal and still sort of see about a tonne yield gain that in that sort of risk environment. However, the flip side of that is that if you're running in a high frost risk environment, or a year like 2017 and 18, the risk of actually flowering earlier than that optimal flowering period is quite severe. So you sort of can be losing a ton of yield. So I guess the whole point around these optimal flowering periods is we're trying to get these out regionally so people have got a bit of a guide as to where they fit. But essentially the risk associated that really, can be quite different and even depend at a farm scale. So if you're farming at Mara with some elevation, you might be happy to play it a little bit earlier. Whereas if you're farming on the Hooligans Creek, at Junee, you might be, really conscious of this potential risk associated with early frost, and you might be sort of happy to push that, back into sort of closer to this less risk window. So I guess the key thing about this is that with the data that we're producing and the modelling approaches that we're using, we're trying to sort of get this information out to growers and advisors to help making these decisions. But the risk associated with this really needs to probably be a bit interpreted at farm scale even as well. So this is where you can start to look at some of these and think about the risk profiles within paddocks and on farm as well. So that's for wheat. And then I've done the same thing for barley. So this is the same here. We've got 3 years of data behind this for barley. So 2 years at Wagga in those 2 frost seasons, as well as the year at Mara last year, which there was relatively very little frost actually in barley in that trial. And the first thing that you can see is if I flip between wheat and then come to barley, is you see that that optimal flowering period shifts quite a bit earlier. So you can see now that sort of period is in the sort of mid to back end of September. So it's a different sort of flowering window. The other thing that you can see is that, you know, it's quite open and a lot flatter at the front end of the window, but quite steep at the back end of the window. And that sort of follows along and fits quite nicely with the diagram that the DPIRD guys have developed in that frost susceptibility for barley, in that potentially barley can probably take on a little bit more frost earlier on. But when we're getting to those grain filling stages, you can see that that sort of risk of frost, you know, in those later grain filling stages can be quite severe. So we're still working at the moment on trying to develop some optimal flowering periods for barley. The model isn't quite as well parameterized for barley as what it is for wheat. So we are sort of working on that. And that's sort of something that's ongoing at the moment. But I guess just to put a bit of perspective in this as well, is not only have we pushed that flowering window earlier, many of you might have noticed those site mean yields. So we were looking at 3 tonne in 2017 for wheat, so 3.7 for barley. And we were looking about 1.7, 1.8 in 2018 and 19 for wheat, but we're up around the 3.5 and just over 3 tonne in 2019. So some significant differences in yield as well, which puts this into a bit more perspective for you. So we certainly do see that this is flatter, but we also can see that in a year where we've got severe frost risk, so like 2017, the risk of actually flowering early can still be quite severe. And if you think that those yields are higher, so the difference from that site mean, you know, can be quite severe as well. So we're still working on refining these windows for barley. So I guess just sort of moving on now, I suppose from that is, I guess, how's the season tracking? And I've just got a couple of scenarios that I ran. Saw Heidi's name on there, so I've got Lockhart in there, and obviously FarmLink here at Temora, so I've put Temora in there. So this is basically just some modelling looking at accumulated thermal time for the season. So the solid lines are the average for the last sort of 10 years prior to 2020, and the dotted line, the dotted line is the average, and the solid line is the current season. So what I've done is I've just basically started accumulation of thermal time from a March sowing, which is the green, from an April sowing, which is this sort of navy colour, and from May, which is the red. And what you can see is that in these earlier times, the earlier times of sowing at both of the, so in that sort of March and April sowing windows, you can see that we're tracking quite a bit cooler relative to the sort of last 10 years for both of these sites, so for both Temora and Lockhart. Whereas in our May sowing, if we start accumulating, we're sowing sort of around the 15th of May, you can see that we're sort of tracking a little bit lower than average, but probably closer to it. So it's this earlier, where we're sort of seeing the sort of difference from average in these earlier sowing times, which is why things are sort of tracking a bit differently, more so in our earlier times of sowing this season. So then just to put another slant on this, if we look at accumulated vernal time, which I know is a really funny thing to get your head around, but this is essentially the number of days of full days to help saturate a vernalisation requirement or response in a variety. So essentially what we're seeing here is the flip side. Because we've had those cooler temperatures, what we're seeing is relative to long-term averages, we've actually accumulated vernalisation quite quickly in both our March and our April sowings relative to the average. And so that's what's been having a big effect. And there's been lots of reports early on in the season of some early sown cereals running a bit ahead and saturating that vernalisation requirement and switching into the stem elongation phases quicker than expected this year. And this is one of the things I think that's sort of largely been influencing that, is that essentially we've been able to sow early because we've had moisture in the ground essentially. And those cooler temperatures have meant that we've actually, for a given day, we've had more hours in that 3 to 15 degree period. And so therefore we've actually accumulated that vernalisation and satisfied that quite quickly. Some of the other factors that are really influencing sort of why some of our, our earlier sown winters, but also some of our vern responsive springs might be tracking a little bit quicker is I think we really do underestimate the influence of interrupting this accumulation of vernalisation. So often we'll sow on a rain event in March to try and get some early feed in. You'll sow a dual purpose cereal in. It's enough rainfall to get it up and established, and then it sits in the ground. There'll be some warm temperature cycling there. There'll also be a period of moisture stress. So the plant's sitting in the ground, you know, stressed in a period of, got the blues, they go all sorts of shades of blue, but essentially during that period where we've got high temperature stress and moisture stress just after establishment, the plant isn't actually really doing much. So that's sort of essentially putting a delay or, you know, holding the plant back in terms of development as well. Whereas what we've seen this year is those early sowings have been able to, progress quite quickly. There's been no real moisture stress. We haven't seen those interruptions with sort of high temperatures cycling in that sort of autumn period. It's been relatively cool, and essentially the conditions have just been perfect for both growth and development. So in addition to slightly quicker development, we've also seen, you know, huge heavy crops produced because there's been lots of vegetative tiller development, and the conditions have been optimal for that. So big crops and pushing a little bit quicker. Whereas you can see here, still a little bit quicker, but we're sort of tracking along closer sort of in those later May sowing windows, which we generally see that all tightens up in a May sowing window anyway. So, but there are some interesting differences regionally. So Heidi, yeah, you might be interested, but yeah, so this is Corowa versus Lockhart. So Lockhart's certainly been a bit cooler in that May period as well. And so be interesting to get your comments on how some of your late sowing crops are going, because I'm assuming that they might have been a bit slower. So just, I suppose, just a last couple of pics just to sort of finish things off. I guess these photos were taken yesterday at our Harefield time of sowing site this year. So we've got sowing dates from early April through to late May. So I just pulled out a couple of key varieties just to show you how things are tracking in the trial. So in our early May sowing, this is Kitty Hawk. And you can see here that we're just sort of starting to see a head starting to poke through in the early April sowing, a little bit behind. And then you can see as we've sort of pushed that sowing date later, we're back into sort of flag leaf emergence phases in our later May sowings. When we look at the same sowing dates, this is Beckham. So what you can see here is that Beckham has actually been touched up. You can see the sort of these pale heads here in Beckham that have actually been frosted. I pulled a few of these apart, and there's a bit of frost damage in these. And interestingly, you can see when we pulled this plant up, you can see that actually it started as a result of some of this to started to sort of re-tiller. So we've got this sort of late influx of tillers in that early sowing window at Beckham, which is going to be interesting for maturity. Then you can see sort of that late April sowing, we've got sort of flowering stages now, and back into our May sowings, we're sort of getting into that ear emergence stages. So that's Beckham. And then I just put in a fast spring, so put in Vixen here. So here you can see Vixen has been hit a bit of a frost wall here in the earlier sowing. You can also, one of the other things that's really interesting, this shows up quite well, is if you look at Vixen sown early versus Vixen in that late May sowing window on the right, the difference in biomass. So when we force our fast spring varieties into an early sowing and they rush quickly, one of the things that we compromise on is not only the risk of, you know, that we're going to get frosted, but also the fact that we're really not setting up as much biomass, and we're not really setting yield potential up even if we didn't see a frost. So you can see that sort of big difference in biomass accumulation there as well between those sowing dates. So just a couple of last slides, just with some interesting things that we've sort of been observing and doing. I suppose one of the key things is that when we're looking to sow early, the key thing is that sow early, sow something slow. And if we're really looking to be going any earlier than Anzac Day, we really need to be looking at something that's got a vernalisation response, because we can see in a year like this that in a sort of, you know, the variation in temperatures in autumn and moisture interactions in autumn, that if you've got something that isn't able to be stable because of a vernalisation response, it can really flip around from year to year. So this is just an example from last year. This is RGT Planet, which was sown to try and get some early feed at Urangilly in here, and it was sown on the 13th of April, and this photo was taken in early August, and you can see here that it's just sort of getting to awn peep. So this particular paddock was really grazed very, very heavily, and I mean the grower did quite well out of early grazing. But I think it's a good example just to show that even under very high grazing pressure, that sort of 2 to 3 weeks early in a sowing window, even under grazing, actually was sort of the equivalent to 5 to 6 weeks quicker to flower, even under that sort of grazing pressure. So we need to be really careful about pushing our sowing windows early with the assumption that, oh, we're going to be able to graze it. And I think there's been a lot of people caught out with that this year, you know, with crops going in early and you know, really looking for feed, which is completely understandable coming off the last couple of years. But and the conditions this year were just so perfect. So it was a nice problem to have, but it meant that a lot of crops weren't able to be probably grazed to induce a delay in development that we would often see. And so I think that's probably contributed to some of these early sown crops getting a little bit away on us as well. So, but yeah, so that's just a point to make. And this is just a really left of field thing that I just thought I'd throw in. We had a grower who had a little silo mix up and who has kindly enabled me to put a bit of a trial in a paddock. So this paddock was mistaken as being Illabo, but it was in fact flanker sown in late March. And this photo was taken on the 1st of July. And what we did was we came in to sort of say, all right, well, you know, this is obviously worst sort of case scenario, but we can't do anything about it now. Are there any options if it's going quick? And this sort of falls back on some of the work that Kenton Porker at Sardi's been doing on the idea of trying to sort of reset phenology and taking out those main heads early and seeing whether we can do that early enough to then promote a second flush of tillers and get some yield compensation that way. So we took on some of the learnings that Kenton's had, and we came into this crop. It was really sort of starting to get to close to flag leaf emergence, so it was probably getting quite late in early July. But nevertheless, we came in and we sort of induced a range of mulching treatments. So right to the boards, sort of about beer can height, a little bit higher again. Then we just went along and just took the tops of them, just the top sort of level of biomass out, but didn't remove everything. And we also put in a spray treatment. So we put in a low water rate gramoxone spray just to see whether if we could burn off the top of the canopy, whether that was enough to induce some new tillers to come. So we're just sort of having a bit of a play, I suppose. And this is what it looked like yesterday. So this treatment on the left is that low mulch to the board. So that's what it looks like when we took basically everything back to the boards. This is the mulching to beer can height in the mulched mid. And on the right, the mulched high was basically where we went along and we just sort of took the top of the canopy off. We did take some heads out, but as you can see, we didn't take all of the heads out. So it continued to push out some of the developing heads, but we've certainly still got a bit of a flush of later tillers in there. And then this, surprisingly, is the gramoxone treatment, which, yeah, it was a bit of a surprise because it's looked pretty bad the whole way through and I thought we'd just killed it. But interestingly enough, we're starting to see a bit of retillering in there. So this is obviously an absolute last case scenario, but anyway, we're sort of just trying to have a bit of a look and see if there's, any options under these scenarios. And then this is just a bit of an example just to show, each of those treatments, what they're looking at like now relative to the control. So you can see each of the treatment, where we've induced a treatment, be it by mulching or spraying, we have been able to promote that sort of tiller regrowth a little bit earlier than what we had we had left it. So anyway, that's just something to leave you with. So some final take-home messages, I guess, from me is that, frost symptoms really directly relate to the development stage. So I guess, identification's key. I think really need to be considering paddock and canopy variation within a paddock. So we've got lots of varieties that are quite asynchronous in their tiller development. And so actually damage might occur in some tillers, but not all. And so I think it's really important to sort of consider the whole canopy approach because if you're just looking at the main tiller and low parts of the paddocks, you might be actually overestimating frost. So just sort of, making sure you're getting a really good, relevant, I suppose, identification of the paddock. Good idea to mark some plants after a frost event and note where they're up to and then come back and review. I suppose one thing this year, don't panic. I guess damage can be actually quite hard to quantify and it takes time to present. The key thing is we know a lot about actually identifying damage. I can look and tell you when the damage occurred and we can do that quite well. What we really find hard is it's really hard to convert that damage into yield loss. And so it's so seasonally dependent and that can be, really hard. So I guess, the key thing is to be, really weighing up your options and making sure you've got a good sort of good understanding of what damage is there. And yeah, I guess, yeah, the key thing is at the moment, you know, phenology is first. We've got to match the phenology and sowing time to target our optimal flowering periods. And that's probably, yeah, our biggest sort of frost mitigation tool at this stage. But that extends, you know, beyond frost. It's really key, and it's probably going to be really quite key coming into potentially these warmer temperatures that are forecast. So I guess, yeah, that's all I had, except, yeah, don't forget, Phenology is fun, and you can follow us on Twitter, and yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Felicity. I could listen to you talk about that forever. That is fantastic. I was lucky enough to work around the site she's got at the moment at Harefield, and it's a credit to the team and how much work goes into that. It's really quite phenomenal. They were there in March dragging hoses and stuff around ready to water up, and then it actually rained for once, so that was kind of null and void. But yeah, thanks a lot, Felicity, for all your work and the team. It's been fantastic.
Thanks, Matt.
And secondly, we do have Ben Bidoff here. He's tuned in, our cross guru from Western Australia. He must love this stuff because he's at every webinar and every event, and he's always keen to put his thoughts forward. So if you've got any questions for Felicity or Ben, open up there's a Q&A box or a chat box there, so feel free to shoot them through.
Yeah. And then just while you go, Matt, yeah, I did have a plug for Ben. So he just sent these to me, yeah, just a couple of days ago. So that, yeah, Ben and his team have done a great job in pulling these frost IDs together, and it's just been updated for cereals. So I think it's, yeah, due to be released in the next week or so. And it's, yeah, some great pictures, and yeah, so I'd recommend trying to find that when it comes out.
Yep, we'll send out a link to all the updated guides and, you know, pretty much everything that you need. But there is also hard copies that we have here at FarmLink. So if anyone wants those, get in touch. My email address will be at the end of the presentation. Okay, thanks a lot, Fliss. We'll move on to, I'll share my screen. And we'll bring in Cieran from Feed Central. If he can just unmute and turn his video on.
Good morning.
Morning, Cieran. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you. Felicity, that was fantastic. Thanks for the information. It was well presented, and it was perfect.
Very good. Thanks for joining us. First of all, do you just want to give us a bit of an overview, I guess, of what Feed Central does and your role in the business?
Yeah, look, our role within probably the hay industry as a whole is 19 years in, or just about in our 19th year. Basically, you know, we're providing the services of either quality assurance and the trade of the product itself, and also doing the feed testing in our laboratory, powered by Dairy One here in Toowoomba. But yeah, look, it's both on-farm inspections, doing a visual inspection on product, both pre-paddock, pre and emergence, and also baling and to the finished product, and then obviously doing the trade and logistics right through to buyers of hay, straw, and any other parts of fodder on a regular basis every year. So our probably business has moved progressively more and more towards the beef sector, although we still deal with the dairy sector in some form or matter, but our beef sector has certainly grown considerably, and certainly supplying to feedlotters and other backgrounders. So it is all about the quality of the feed, and also getting the right quality to the right buyer, and that's what we do.
Very good. We had a brief discussion last week, I suppose, about last year and the amount of hay that was produced, and then the sort of buying frenzy that happened through till January. I suppose you want to give us a bit of an update on that, and then sort of the cutoff when once feed started to really ramp up on the East Coast. Yeah,
sure. I suppose to put it simply, obviously we all know we've come out of a fairly drastic drought period, and we've been having a boom for 2 years in regards to, I suppose, both production in the south and also prices as well, which many unfortunately suffered the high prices that are out there. And I say very clearly, our system is a system where the grower sets the price. So And the hay market is one market where it's very difficult in regards to pricing because there's no liquidity in the fodder market. So we don't have unlike the grain market where you can receive a price on a daily basis. The fodder market doesn't have any liquidity in there. So something can happen overseas in the Red Sea, or some trader can fall off his chair, and it may affect the grain price, but it certainly doesn't have an effect on the fodder pricing market. So the only thing that affects our market is basically the conditions. And although obviously the conditions affect everyone in ag when they're growing product, but in general for us on a pricing market, it's just basically the conditions. So it did rain in February, and as we always see, it is no surprise to us when we get to the end of a drought and it rains, your market stops pretty much there and then, and as it did at the beginning of this year when it did rain through February and parts of March, the market shut down. There was also a decline, obviously, on cattle on feed, whether it be in paddock or feedlots were starting to come back a little bit in numbers, and that has progressively continued throughout this year. So therefore, your demand, not only your rain was coming, you were getting pasture growth, and we've got customers that have got more pasture than they know what to do with and not enough cattle at this stage. So we've gone from feast or famine. So on that basis, you've got declining cattle numbers, the weather has come in, and therefore it's having even more effect on your market due to the conditions. The buying frenzy that happened in January, probably, I think I suggested to you last week, was the equivalent of toilet paper buying. It probably really didn't need to happen. Everyone thought it was probably never going to rain again. And then we had the fires, and there was probably a misconception there that the fires were going to cause another big run on fodder, and God forbid we were going to run out. That was probably never going to happen, although it could have happened. Look, if it didn't rain, there's no doubt fodder supplies would have got very, very low, and it could have been the very first time in history that we've run out of fodder. But in saying that, now we've got 1920 supplies running through, and there's no doubt there will be 1920 hay sitting in sheds into 21. So we do have some overflow running from that, considering in everything that we've been through so far. So
very good. And I suppose looking from 1920 into this year, how's the market progressing? I suppose for new season crop, we've seen some vetch and a few other things hitting the ground in the mallee, and SA sort of a bit drier, and a few crops starting to get cut around there.
Yeah, absolutely, and there has been some frost-affected crops as well. So, I mean, just on the frost side of things, if we're talking about that, the timing of things is always key and important. Whether we're looking at that 70.2 to 79, so we want that flowering time where it's just that milky dough development. If you're going to cut hay cut a product that's been frosted, there is fraught with danger if you're doing it too early, and then obviously if it's too late, you're going to have grain starting to progress, which then is going to cause you storage issues and becomes a real mice problem if you're storing that product for a long time. So on the frost side of things, our suggestion is that if you don't have storage, hay production is not obviously in your normal production window program. If you don't have storage or you don't have buyer off the paddock, then it's definitely would be worthwhile going through to whatever grain recovery that you can get would be probably your best option at this stage. There's no doubt that this year is going to be a storage year, so you will more likely see hay that's been produced this year could be sitting in sheds for the next 1, 2, even 2.5 to 3 seasons. So the key to it is just making sure that you've got the economic side ready to go. You can store, you can fill up. Many growers will try and sell a good bulk of their hay in spring when demand is usually low. Outside of any drought times, the demand is traditionally low. So regular users in the year in, year out, if they've got empty sheds, yes, they'll be in the market to buy and fill up those sheds in that spring period. But of course, this is also, the seasonal conditions, be it what they're in, be it beef or dairy and their sector itself. So do they have the stock? Do they need the shed filled up or not? And are the finances there to do that after coming out of 2 droughts? So prices, outputs and livestock markets all have an effect on that purchasing period of spring, particularly for backgrounders. For feedlotters, there's no doubt, there is pressure in that market at the moment, both on the processing side and also the cattle coming in and pricing. So look, we would expect, there's no doubt the market is definitely very, very quiet. It's probably the quietest we have ever seen it leading into a spring. So therefore, if you are looking at producing hay, storage is the key, and having the finances to store that. Often, a lot of our growers that we have, where they will do grain and hay on a regular basis as part of their program, year in, year out. What you will find in those businesses is that the early sale and early contracting of grain will finance the hay sitting in the shed and waiting for the better prices in the year as in the season as you come through to winter. So that is a regular pattern for regular producers of hay and grain as a combination.
Yeah, we discussed, I suppose, as well about quality this year and what actually will sell. If you're producing something, we've seen a hell of a lot of vetch and that sort of thing grown. You got any comments sort of on what people would look for if there was sort of some hay floating around or keen to buy?
Yeah, look, if anyone that's if they're buying up in spring and they're not necessarily feeding it out straight away, they're looking for obviously heavy bales, good moisture and quality product, which we would consider an A-grade product and above to put in your shed, and obviously heavy bales in regards to transportation and making it the economics work on that side. But in general, as far as the product is concerned, look, we're yet to see the bulk of hay made, because the bulk of hay made, 85–90% of the hay produced in Australia is throughout that northern Victoria, South Australia, WA, and also, of course, the southern regions of New South Wales. So on that side of things, if product is getting damaged on the ground with the predicted weather that we've got to come, if we end up in a 2016 scenario where, look, there was a lot of product made, there was a bit of lodging, there was probably few losses than expected, because the sun did come out for 5 or 6 weeks, cutting was done, curing was fairly good, and all the hay got in the bale, and we had lots of hay stuck in, not stuck in sheds, but certainly stacked in sheds and good stock levels for the next 2 years. So if it ends up like a year like that, the quality will be good. Obviously, if we end up with further wetting conditions and stuff getting damaged, product getting damaged on the ground and having lodging issues, and then we've got curing issues, you could end up with lost product on the ground. And then you got moisture issues trying to get it cured and get it into the bale. So that's where we could see certainly some product fall off and not succeed through a higher grade. It doesn't mean that lower grade product doesn't sell. It does, but what you will find, it will be a later sell. So the higher grade product will sell obviously first. As far as demand is concerned, it is still low, and it's definitely going to be low throughout the season until we get closer to winter in 2021, and that will give us an idea of where the demand is then. If the conditions remain as they predict, you would expect that pasture levels will remain fairly good for the feed side of things, on the cattle side and dairy side. So we could be heading into next winter could be a real average demand, not necessarily over the top. In fact, it could even be a little bit low, just depending on those conditions. But as far as the product was concerned, look, I know a lot of vetch went in this year, and there was probably a good reason for that, is that during the drought periods that we've had over the last 2 seasons, a lot of backgrounders and people feeding actually were exposed to vetch, and they'd probably never used it before for many. So, and the bang for buck, if you're looking at a cereal hay to a vetch to say a lucerne, vetch is becoming that real golden child in between, that's going to give feeders a good bang for buck in between. It doesn't work for everyone. If for feedlotters in instance, for intake cattle, cattle don't necessarily rush to vetch straight away as soon as they run off the truck. They will traditionally run to a cereal hay that has nice sugars and nice aromas and good digestibility. It'll take a little bit longer to get onto a vetch, but once cattle do get on, or once they start feeding on vetch, they'll chew it up like lollies, and they love it. So you do have a lot of backgrounders and a lot of people feeding cattle that have been exposed to vetch over the last 2 years. So if they're chasing a bit of protein and slightly up from the cereal hays into the winter, into next year, there's no doubt many buyers will be pointing towards vetch on a bang for buck value compared to what they may be paying for lucerne. So certainly it's becoming a definitely competitive product moving forward, and particularly in the north, because in Victoria and those regions, the vetch is just a norm, and there's great experience with it. Whereas if you get further north, there's less and less experience on the vetch as far as feeding it out is concerned, but it certainly has been over the last 2 years.
Very good. Thanks for that, Cieran. I think just into 2021, is there any real thoughts on the market, and are cattle numbers slowly increasing, or are they still trying to build up? What's the general consensus there?
Oh, look, the cattle market is we know, if anyone could guess where that cattle market was going to go, they'd probably make some pretty good money if they were betting. But at the end of the day, it really will depend on the rebuild of the herd. So we're definitely going to be in that rebuild phase now for probably the next, at least I'd say, into 2 seasons. The cattle numbers in the feedlots, yes, they are back. Depending on who you talk to, it might be 20%, it might be 25%, it might be 30%. There are also some feeders there that are full as well. So, they're having great success, and there's some longer feed scenarios happening. So your cattle are staying in the feed for longer. And therefore that's affecting probably the type of ration that's being fed. But certainly I think we're in a rebuild phase. Cattle prices are still high, so it's difficult to replace that herd. As I said, there's many of a customer that we've got where they've got more pasture on the ground and not enough cattle. So trying to get back into that market and rebuild that herd for them is obviously expensive. So you need some deep pockets and an understanding bank manager to do that for you and with you. So we're going to be in that phase. Demand in general will remain low. So the key message for anyone on the production side of things is that in this season, storage and cash flow is going to be the go. So good storage, the right financing to keep it stored for a period of time, for a long period of time. And if you're choosing between going through to fodder or doing grain, at this stage, obviously, with the way the market is, and I do understand grain prices are altering as well, but the safe bet would be to head to grain if you do not have the storage and the facilities to keep it for a longer period of time. Prices will traditionally always start to get better as we move closer to winter. So the normal pattern for many is that they will sell a portion of their fodder in the spring with early contracting, probably on spreads contracts for a year or off the paddock. But the off the paddock demand will be very, very low. So there's just a cautionary there, and obviously with the forecasted conditions, you don't want product sitting in the paddock, because more likely you're going to lose considerable grade of hay there as well. Yep.
Very good. Well, thanks for that overview, Cieran. Really appreciate you coming on, and you're probably your busiest time of the year, and obviously Feed Central is going from strength to strength. So if anyone wants to get in contact with you, is it best by email or through the website? Or?
Yeah, look, via email. There's obviously lots of information on the website as well. We've just released a little bit late. We were just a little bit late with getting it out this year, but we've just released our 2021 hay book and production. So that's lots of questions and answers in regards to what the recommendations are for the season moving forward. And I think that'll be going out on social media probably today, if we get the timing right. So yeah, and of course contact myself or the team direct at Feed Central. We can assist in any way.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Cieran. We'll leave it there, and yeah, all the best for the season.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks for having us.
Cheers. Okay, moving on. We've got our regional agronomists here ready to go. We'll start off with Ed Nixon. Ed's an agronomist with IK Caldwell in Corowa. He sort of runs a farm at Baldale as well. I think I remember driving past his place and saw a Delver for the first time and absolutely crapped himself. But that's he does some pretty cool things down there. How are you, Ed?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thank you.
We'll just start with, I suppose, your region, mate, and where you cover, and yeah, what's happening down your way. It's a bit hard to get down there at the moment, so I haven't seen it.
Yeah, so I'm based in Corowa, out of Corowa region, and look after pretty much 150 k's of my clients around there, and in a region. So yeah, to Jerilderie, and then there's a couple of guys across the border that we look after. Not me specifically, but some of our agros out of that store. So yeah, that's our sort of region.
And how's things tracking at the moment in terms of how did sowing go? Were you on time and happy, and variety-wise, you're tracking okay?
Look, we had it was one of those sowings because we got some rain. Everything's been. We got some guys going really early. We had some guys, you know, looking for some early feed. So we had early oats, early barley, just to get some really quick feed in, and some of those winter types go in quite early for grazing. And we had rain interruptions all the way through, really, which slowed some people down a bit, which was pretty handy. We got into the spring types pretty early, I would say, around that Anzac Day period or just before, and some barley probably pretty early. And so far, because we haven't, the last frost we've had was about the 1st of September, even though they're flowering a bit earlier, we're getting away with it at this stage. So let's just hope that we don't get any more frosts going forward like we did in 2013 down in Temora. That wasn't very fun on that 18th of October one. So let's hope we miss those ones. That'd be very nice.
Yep.
So yeah, we sort of got rain around that 1st of May, and that slowed everyone down again. So those main season wheats sort of went in at the right time.
Very good. And yourself, Heidi, you're a sort of similar situation based out of Lockhart with Delta Ag. You sort of cover a bit west and a bit east, I guess.
Yeah, that's right, Matt. Thanks very much to you and to FarmLink for inviting me to be a part of this morning. It's great to catch up with a few and see what's going on around the traps. So I guess I cover from sort of west of Urana through to Huron Creek in the east. So it's a fair gamut of an area. And I guess as a broad brush, our rainfall year to date ranges sort of between 340 and 440 millimetres, and ironically there's been more rain to the west than there has been to the east, so that's a bit of a different scenario. But in actual fact it's a good thing, because in areas that are a bit flatter and a bit more prone to waterlogging, it's actually been I guess a perfect season in terms that it hasn't been too wet, it's not too dry, so really crops that have been sown earlier on time are sitting pretty well. So, our growing season rainfall to date is sitting between 200 and 220 millimetres. So we're really on track, and, provided, the management is in check with most crops, I think we're certainly, barring a catastrophe, looking at some pretty reasonable yields, across the board, which would be pretty exciting after the last 3, if not 4 years. I mean, for some guys, 2016 was pretty disastrous too on the flat stuff.
Yeah, and how's sort of the western region, Urana and those sorts of places where they got some pretty heavy country? Are they still okay? Everything went in all right?
Yep, look, pretty good. There was some heavy falls of rain around Easter time, which certainly did compromise some establishment, but on the whole, crops were in on time, established well. Nothing's really slowed them down. So I guess pretty similar to Ed, we've got some crops that maybe went in a fraction early, and I'm not too sure about down your way, Ed, but we've certainly had a significant swing with the livestock job being so good. We've had a significant swing back to dual purpose crops that went in early because there was good opportunity. People were screaming out for sort of some early feed and most importantly ground cover. So, our predominantly wheat and oats were sown early, and obviously some vetch was sown very early outside its window, and that's had some challenges in terms of disease pressure, and for a lot of our vetch is certainly not going to be good enough for hay. Sorry, Feed Central, but it's certainly been challenged by the wet weather and disease pressure, and a lot of crops won't make it to the end. But they've done their purpose. They've provided ground cover and some feed, and looking good. So canola probably has looked as good as it's been for many years. So really, farmers have been able to choose a system and a length of variety with canola that's really suited their program, and everything's going to plan there. And yeah, look, barley, we've got a great mix of Spartacus, Latrobe and Planet, and again, they're all just at that awn peep and head emergence, and some are well into flowering. So so far so good.
Very good. And yourself, Chris, up there at Forbes, Baker Ag Advantage, private agronomist. Drove through there on the weekend. Things are looking good, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for putting this on. Yeah, look, we're having a great run, which is really good. We're pretty spoiled at the minute. We're feeling very, very blessed. We've kind of had 450 to 500 mil since about the second week of Feb, so things are chugging along pretty well. Similar to how Heidi explained it, we kind of jumped in a lot earlier than what we should have, and sowed oats and all sorts of things. We've got growers that have cut silage in the start of August, cutting silage again now. We've got retained TT canola seed that went in March and is still flowering. It's full of blackleg and alternaria and all sorts of stuff. But yeah, we were just chasing ground cover and feed, and look, you know, things have gone really well to date. So a lot of our wheats are, you know, ahead of emergence and flowering now, which is pretty much spot on for Forbes and west of the Newell. Barley's flowering and starting to grain fill, so a lot of our barley crops look really strong. Planet doing really well. The Trove, probably I'd say 60 to 70% of our canola is starting to finish up flowering. West of the Newell, east of the Newell is obviously still poking along pretty well, and we really haven't seen a lot of frost damage. We might have had a dozen days below zero in Forbes, a dozen to 15, which is really well and truly below par. Condo is probably the same. I think our lowest temperature is minus 2.9 at the start of August, so we really haven't had too many issues in regards to frost. Other than that, we're chugging along pretty well. Noticed a little bit of mice damage in canola yesterday in canola trials at the research station at Condo, which was a bit surprising. We're not seeing it in a paddock scale at the minute, but definitely to the north of our area, Tottenham and north of there, they're starting to talk about mice in canola, so that'll be the next thing. But yeah, we haven't done any insecticides yet in our pulses or canola. Just a few Heliothus starting to poke about at the minute, but other than that, we're feeling very, very lucky and got our eyes peeled for what's around the corner, but ticking off the days on the calendar.
Yes, I think we're all counting down the days. I was up north, sort of up towards Gilgandra and Armatree on the weekend, and they were talking about baiting out of the plane for mice this week. So nothing on the edges, but they were in crop, and you know, those bait cards that the GRDC give out, they were polishing them overnight. So certainly something to watch out for. In terms of you, Ed, I suppose you're planning for flowering in the right window this year. Did you see anything different once we had moisture? Did you really have to pull those guys back and say, look, we've got moisture, but, you know, hold back? Or did you make any changes with varieties and that sort of thing?
Most guys have been listening to like the likes of Felicity and are using the varieties where they should be. We sow the winter types in those early timings, either for grazing like Heidi spoke about, or for just getting across some country for some of the big guys and just using that as I've got to get started somewhere, otherwise I'll never get done. So that's worked pretty well. And then normally our biggest issue in the last few years has always been, we get the early wheats in, we get our canolas in, and then we're stuck around Anzac Day going, what do we do now? What do we do now? And either we've been pushing barley or into that region, or we've been pushing some of those longer springs into that region, like the Trojans. And some of them have gone in pretty early, and because they've, you know, this year the vern, it's all gone through pretty quickly. They're really pushing early. But something I have noticed this year, and Felicity touched on it, the winter types this year are kind of flower about the same time as the spring types. And I think that's because that vern's come in so quickly and it's gone through its vern requirement. And they have a lot of potential this year where they normally flower a bit late and get into that heat. They might be flowering at the right time and give us huge potential because they've been in that extra month and extra root growth and all that sort of stuff. But so that'll be pretty interesting, I think. Yeah,
we sort of had that discussion with Rowan 2 weeks ago about working on getting a 970 equivalent in canola to flower a little, or to wake up a little bit earlier. We sort of get that amazing feed at the start, but if they can then, you know, run to flower a little bit earlier and make the most of it. But on the flip side, I suppose down around Ballarat and places like that, they're really making the most of that October rain that they get. So I guess the phenology around that's probably going to be as critical as anything going forward. And Heidi, what about yourself? Like in terms of your timing and that sort of thing, you're finding that you've got enough to fill each gap and each window, or are you sort of holding guys up a bit?
Look, I think we've learned some really valuable lessons over the last 3 years in particular. In our area, like many, have been hit so hard with frost. Now, I understand that's obviously, you know, environment related in terms of it's been incredibly dry, and that frosting has sort of been severe in terms of the collision between low temperatures and dry surface moisture. So but that's been a lesson that we have such a suite of varieties. I think the better guys, as Ed alluded to, that you know, I think we've got enough in our armoury that we can really get our bigger guys going with some early sown things. You know, in Lockhart, it's been on the early work that James Hunt brought to us, and obviously now Felicity. You know, we're quite comfortable with winding those sowing rates back of our winter wheats and sowing them as a standalone crop. And just on that comment that Ed made, one observation that I've made is that we've got a really high area this year to those dual purpose crops. And on the whole, because the season they established well, we just didn't have the stock numbers to graze them efficiently. So I'm seeing the large majority of our winter wheats, so our Illibos, Wedgetails, Kitty Hawks, sort of coming out in head and flowering, and they've got just as good a yield potential as our spring wheats. So the same thing, we normally don't see that. But the comment I'd like to make, and it'd be interesting to hear Felicity's comment, is that because they weren't grazed efficiently enough, they've obviously matured. Maybe that's helped them with greater leaf area. They've just it's just sort of helped them, I suppose, behave a bit with the mild conditions. They're behaving almost like a spring wheat at this time of year. So it's they certainly weren't grazed back to the boards, that we just didn't have enough stock numbers.
We've got Felicity here. Do you have a comment there on that, Felice, or just?
Oh, I think, yeah, I mean, certainly agree with what, Ed and Heidi have said about the grazing. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's been one of the big things I think that has also contributed to the fact that some of these winter crops sort of have been a bit quicker this year in terms of saturating it, because we just haven't had, apart from obviously saturating vernalisation so quickly, we haven't had the development holds induced on them, which we normally would see from grazing and, interruption with warmer temperatures or soil moisture, a bit of moisture stress during autumn. They've just been perfect conditions, and certainly the grazing pressure and just the bigger number, like larger area of dual purpose wheats, and has been a big thing too, I think, particularly as Heidi mentioned, more of it and less mouths to get across it too. So look, that's certainly, agree with all of that sort of, and it's going to be quite interesting to see how things sort of fare up, in terms of yield this year. So no, it's going to be really interesting, because certainly we do see those, those winter wheats, they all are, because of that vernalisation requirement, sort of flowering probably at the, mid to late of that optimal flowering window, where often our spring wheats are flowering at the start of that optimal flowering window. So it can be quite significant in a dry finish, particularly. So it's interesting to see how that's gonna pan out this year. But so no, I agree with all that, and I think it's going to be interesting. Curious, Heidi and Ed, and about the dual purpose wheats. What are the canopies like in them? Big canopies?
Yeah, pretty big and bulky.
Especially on grazed ones, and we've done a bit of growth regulant to try and in some paddocks to try and stop it a bit, because it was already going over back ages ago. So we'll see how that turns out at the end of the day. I mean, it's a hard one for growers when they see a lot of bulk next to it, and something they've untreated, and going, I wish I had that, but we'll see how it ends in the end.
Yeah. No, that's just an interesting one, I suppose.
Sorry, please. Yeah. I've just got a paddock at home, and that's the hard part, is that, you know, sheep have grazed one end really heavily and then sort of left the other end. So it's almost going to be 2 times a harvest if that comes to fruition. It's you're almost splitting the paddock in 2. I did look at it doing a variable rate growth regulant just to put some on the other end, just to try and slow it down a bit. But yeah, Chris, have you got a lot of dual purpose crops up there, or are you mostly just putting you know, your spring ones in?
Yeah, we have. We've got a good selection of them in, and a bit the same as what Ed and Heidi have touched on. We probably haven't really, I don't know, grazed 50% of them, I would suggest. So it's going to be a really interesting comparison. The other thing that we have probably had numerous cases of, and way too many, is seed mix-ups this year. We've got all sorts of things that were supposed to be wedge-tail and supposed to be kitty hawk and haven't been, and also some of our main season wheats that we, you know, thought were Lancer and get belted by rust, and test results coming back saying they're not. So, you know, a first good year for a lot of people. Like Heidi said, we had flood in 16, and it's really been the first, I suppose, normal year where we can look at stuff how it's supposed to be, and it's uncovered quite a few errors on growers' behalf, which is making things a bit trickier.
Very good. Thanks for that, Chris. I suppose, Ed, we'll just touch lastly on what's keeping you busiest at the moment in terms of, are you guys still really working on fungicides and that sort of thing down there, or is that with the temperatures sort of gone away now?
Nah, it's definitely fungicide disease at the moment is what we're chasing, which is much nicer than chasing, you know, whether we're going to cut for hay or keep for grain in the last couple of years. So it's a nice change, means it's actually raining. Yeah, so look, stripe rust is the main one at the moment. It's pretty rampant, really getting into some, like we grow a lot of Trojan down here, and then Trojan became a susceptible variety with that new strain of rust. And yeah, it's really, really taking a lot on. We found Impact's been really good holding it back. Like Impact on, or like flutriafol on the fertilisers really held it back. But yeah, it's not getting it through even with Trojan far enough. And we grow Bennett down here as well. It's the same and longer season. And then yeah, chasing diseases in vetch and barley, and just it's been diseased for about the last month. As Chris said, yeah, we couple of silo mix up or going, this is supposed to be this, but it wasn't. It's amazing, you know, it was spread out over a month of sowing Scepter between about the 1st of April and the Anzac Day. And it's only the first stuff that he sowed on around that 1st April time that has been hit so far with frost, and it is starting to re-kill it now. So it's that's the only bit of frosting we've seen so far. So we've been lucky that way. Yeah, just a bit of, you know, we haven't had the many frosts, and we've had the water in the soil to buffer it.
Mm-hmm. And same thing with you, Heidi, disease, the main issue?
Yeah, definitely, and it's certainly keeping us busy, and I guess I reckon, well, hopefully it's a record, and hopefully I don't see it again, but I observed our first significant stripe rust on the 21st of June this year in Bennett. We've had a big swing away in our area from flutriafol at sowing time, and I think that's come back to bite us a bit this year, and just trying to save a few dollars up front. So that's something that'll come back into the system for those guys that aren't, you know, undertaking VR starter fertiliser. So certainly stripe rust has been a big thing. Obviously Trojan, Scepter, Condo, and I guess disappointingly Catapult and Vixen have really taken on rust as in seed increase blocks. So that's been disappointing. The Vixen has come back as the strain of the 239 strain, which according to Andrew Milgate and his team is a pretty virulent strain, and we're keeping a really close eye on varieties such as Beckham and Gregory, which we've certainly seen some rust in Gregory, but we feel the APR, once that heads out, should take care of it. But the Beckham, you know, we're still a little bit undecided, you know, which way we go, you know. In the good old days of 2005, and when the rust ratings were 1 to 10, I think they were, MRMSs were 5s and we were spraying them then. So we're just trying to be as vigilant as we can, monitoring paddocks, and if we get a few showery days over the next week, I think that will really tell the tale. So yeah, so we're certainly, you know, keeping an eye out for that. Scald in barley's been one this year that I haven't seen this bad since probably Schooner back in 2010. And I had sort of anticipated that the pressure would be off the scald as the weather warmed up, but this last week, it's a bit worrying. It's actually still progressing in some crops and we're needing to cover them. But yeah, that's certainly something that I guess from a research point of view, we need to get a bit more information on, you know, going forward, because these new varieties, they seem to be suckers for disease. And obviously now that weather's warmed up, we can't lose sight of net blotch either. And there's certainly plenty of that in the lower canopy, and hopefully it doesn't creep too far up toward the top couple of leaves and the head. So a bit of low level armyworm floating around. I guess the difference between now and a number of years ago, we sort of look at our crops a lot more and a lot more closely than we used to. So I think we've got to be a little bit careful not to, you know, spray every paddock all the time for everything. And it's just a matter of understanding whatever pest or disease it is and knowing thresholds and things, rather than get too carried away and just throw an insecticide in for the sake of it. So just got to assess those armyworm, keep an eye on them, and hopefully we do get this rain over the next, you know, few days and keep things ticking along and keep our yield potential up.
Yeah, I think sort of some west of the Newell, but sort of Toowoomba and Ardleth and a few places are starting to search for it. So fingers crossed it lands where it needs it. And yourself, Bakes, are you the same as those guys chasing disease, or is that sort of pressure eased off and a bit further advanced along?
Yeah, mate, we're pretty much wrapped up most of our fungicide work, which is good. We were lucky to, you know, 3 weeks ago we were probably a little bit wet in spots, but we've been able to get on and do ground rigs where applicable, or planes where we've had to, and yeah, variety's pretty much behaving similar to what Heidi said. Been a little bit disappointed with Catapult. I kind of thought it might have held up a little bit better, but it's been a bit disappointing in our seeding crease blocks. Barley much the same. We'll probably pull the trigger on insecticides in Ola and pulses in 10 days, I reckon. And then yeah, we'll be starting to wrap things up pretty well. Then we'll watch for mice, which won't be much fun, but we'll kind of be on track to windrow canola last 10 days of October, I reckon. So that'll come around quickly. And yeah, other than that, hopefully people are trying to work out what to do with all the grain.
It's a good problem to have. Okay, guys, we'll leave it there. Thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate you coming on, and so nice to have experts in the field and regional agronomists and that sort of thing come and join us. And as FarmLink, we're really, really privileged that you take the time to do it. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for organising.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks for inviting us.
In terms of resources, obviously we will send out an A4 sheet with anything you need in terms of frost assessment, diagnosis, the updated frost ID guide. So thanks again to Ben for working so hard on that. Email myself, Matt at FarmLink, for a hard copy. There's also the GRDC frost management landing page where there's a lot of information for in-season management, pre-season and post-frost responses. So there's plenty of information out there, and if you need any help with that, please give me a call or send me an email. And I suppose what's next for us at FarmLink, we will be holding pre-season workshops for frost planning on the back of these exercises. So any feedback you've got is more than welcome, and we'll sort of run one in each region: Central West, FarmLink region, and then Rift Plains. Harvester discussion forums are coming up, so there's 4 sites where we'll get some gear together and just talk about harvester losses, harvest weed seed control and fires, and just to get your head in the game, I suppose. And then looking for that further, some hands-on precision ag training courses for the northern region. So thank you everyone for attending. Thanks to the GRDC for their investment in this. I think we've shown today that there's plenty of interest and some great people that we can turn to in terms of that information. Thanks to Felicity, it's a massive amount of effort to go to deliver that that presentation. And obviously her team and the climate team as well for their help. Scott has been a great help to me. Thanks to Cieran and the Feed Central team. It's busy time for them. The agronomy panel members, like I said, fantastic and great insight into the region. And thanks to the FarmLink team for putting up with me and that sort of thing. So I think we'll leave it there, guys. There's no open questions. If you've got any questions, my details are on the screen. And yeah, good luck with the rest of the season.